battleships ever to sail the world's oceans. Deep inside the armored hull, men program critical data into a sophisticated central nervous system. Its origins date to the last century. At their command, the guns fire with fearful accuracy. For 100 years, proud symbols of the world's mightiest nations. Great fighting machines that had no equal. Home to that special breed of fighting man, the battleship sailor. Victors and victims in the war at sea. On their decks have unfolded many a turning point in the history of the 20th century. The battleship, long thought unsinkable, indestructible, until the morning of December 7, 1941, when at Pearl Harbor, her mastery of the sea seemed over, eclipsed by the terrible power and accuracy of carrier-based aircraft. Yet she reappears in Korea and Vietnam. And 50 years after the premature report of her death at Pearl Harbor, her weapons echo across the waters of the Persian Gulf. Once again, the battleship is back. This is her story. The 2nd of August, 1990. Iraq's invasion of Kuwait has been met with a swift response. A coalition of Western and Arab nations has created a massive buildup of armament in Saudi Arabia. President George Bush issues a final ultimatum to the Iraqi president: withdraw from Kuwait or face overwhelming force. As 1991 begins, the United States adds the final weapons to the coalition's arsenal. Two of America's aging battleships will answer the call. For months, the USS Missouri has been making preparations for her third war. Her firepower has been modernized as she prepares to join her sister, the battleship Wisconsin, already in the Gulf. 16 January, Iraq ignores the coalition's ultimatum. 17 January, 1:40 a.m., the crew of the Missouri is at General Quarters.
Execute launch sequence.
Missouri Captain Lee Case.
The Tomahawks, of course, were the first ones launched in the war, and this was the first time that the battleship Missouri entered the modern age with modern weapons. We had never had the opportunity to fire those before, and every one of them worked as advertised.
And the Missouri's basic armament, her 50-year-old 16-inch guns, were fired in anger for the first time since the Korean War. The target was the port city of Khafji, Saudi Arabia. To get within range, the Missouri moved into the shallows. There were only 3 feet of water beneath her keel. Lee Case.
Well, when the big guns were fired in anger for the first time during the Gulf War, a cheer could be heard from one end of the ship to the other. You could hear over the sound-powered phones the excitement of all the people in the plotting rooms. The turret that got to fire the first round, I think, was probably the big heroes of the day at that particular time.
Later, when the ground war to recapture Kuwait began, the Missouri pounded away with her big guns to support the soldiers and Marines ashore. She fired one 16-inch round every 15 seconds, 9 guns firing in rotation, reloaded in under 1 minute per barrel. In just 2 hours, the Missouri had fired 133 rounds. Not bad for an aging lady. But one of the Missouri's most effective new weapons never fired a shot. The RPVs, or remotely piloted vehicles, were the Missouri's own spotters, like the battleship float planes of old. The miniature aircraft featured 2 camera systems, one for day, the other infrared for night viewing, when they could be most effective. The RPVs were 14 feet long, their wingspan 17 feet. Their computerized controls were operated by a pilot inside the battleship's superstructure. Rocket launched to an altitude of 200 feet in less than 2 seconds, the plane's 2-cycle engine then took over. Over the enemy target, the RPV sends pictures and coordinates back to the ship. The pictures are fed into the closed-circuit TV system. An Iraqi food truck stops at a series of bunkers along a road. It is spotted by the cameras of the unheard RPV 1,500 feet above. The positions are fed into the Missouri's computer, and when the big guns fire, they are precisely on target. Proof positive that the 50-year-old big guns can still do their work. For Lee Case, the RPV was the perfect airborne spotter.
So there was a perfect blend of the old and new on board Missouri in the Gulf War, and both the old and the new contributed to our success.
The USS Missouri fights on. America's most historic battleship, the newest technology now grafted to her aging body. Like her battleship sisters, she was born to another time, another place. Far from the Persian Gulf, off the Hawaiian island of Oahu, is the watery graveyard of another great battleship. The remains of some 900 American sailors and Marines still lie within her twisted wreck. The battleship Arizona rests quietly below the peaceful waters of Pearl Harbor. Oil still escapes from her tanks, for this was once a living ship, forever doomed on the morning of December 7, 1941. Was the bugler on the USS West Virginia.
I sounded first call around 5 minutes to 8 for colors. We were looking towards the Arizona and then towards the 2 mountains there, and then we saw a group of airplanes coming in, and we thought that they were ours.
Dan Martinez is an historian at the Arizona Memorial. On the morning of December 7, 1941, his grandfather was finishing his night shift.
He was walking to his car when the first torpedo planes roared right overhead about 150 feet in altitude. At first he thought it was just a mock battle or drill.
It was no drill. At 7:55 that Sunday morning, the clock began to tick away the final minutes of the battleship era. The great warships were all there, awaiting Admiral's inspection. Skilled Japanese pilots who had long practiced for this secret mission, the American battleships moored so tightly in a row were a textbook target to which they brought new and terrible weapons of war.
The development of a shallow water torpedo was essential to the success of the attack. The Japanese knew that Pearl Harbor was only 45 feet deep.
American commanders felt secure in Pearl Harbor. They were sure torpedoes required a depth of 100 feet before they could be effective. But they were wrong.
We just took torpedo after torpedo, and come to find out we had actually 9 torpedoes in us.
Equally destructive was the armor-piercing bomb dropped from an altitude of 10,000 feet.
The point of this bomb, with its delayed action fuse, was meant to penetrate inside the ship, then explode.
We were looking towards the Arizona when this whistle come by. It sounded like a freight train. and it landed just forward of the #1 gun turret.
The Arizona foundered in 9 minutes and burned for 2.5 days. $1,177 men lost their lives on the Battleship Arizona that morning.
Explore. Coming up, the tide of the war changes as the U.S. strikes back to avenge Pearl Harbor when Discovery Sunday continues. Next Sunday night, they are ancient, powerful, beautiful, and deadly. In the world of predator versus prey, they reign supreme. Anaconda, giant snake of the Amazon on Discovery Sunday. Next Sunday at 8 Eastern and Pacific on the Discovery Channel.
The word is about. There's something evolving. Whatever may come, the world keeps revolving. They say the next big thing is here, that the revolution's near. But to me it seems quite clear that it's all just a little bit of history repeating.
How can we sell more cars? More stuff? What will it take to build this company?
To beat this disease. When do I get to play? At Compaq, we put more power and more tools into the hands of more people than any other computer company, so they can find more answers, better answers.
How can I make my mark?
Compaq, better answers.
Is there a hog in your yard? Well, there ought to be. If you want to cut branches twice as thick as most other hedge trimmers cut, go hog wild with the Hedgehog. Built by Black & Decker.
You lost the address?
Relax, honey.
Listen, can the testosterone and let's call for directions.
The house has a new metal roof. It'll stick out like...
Yeah, like your butt in a bathing suit. That's it. Oh, that was it.
That was a metal roof.
Take a look at the new metal roofing. Call 1-888-METAL-ROOF for a free video.
That's a metal roof.
1-800-CONTACTS is the world's largest contact lens store, with 4 million contacts in stock and 50,000 shipped every day. You'll get delivery right away. Call 1-800-CONTACTS. We deliver. You save. 1-800-CONTACTS. Exact same contact lenses, delivered to your door for less than you're paying now. Call 1-800-CONTACTS. We deliver. You save.
From the Discovery Channel and ABC News, Discovery News Break.
Good evening, everyone. A new genetic therapy has successfully treated obesity in lab animals. Researchers implanted mice with DNA designed to produce chemicals that suppress the brain's appetite signals. And astronomers have detected a comet-like tail trailing 500,000 miles behind the moon. The tail may be made of gases escaping from the moon's thin atmosphere. That's Discovery News Break.
Dear society, please accept my resignation.
Introducing exploration gear for the feet. The North Face never stopped exploring.
The sweet smell of apple, cinnamon, and spice simmering. The look and feel of a gift handcrafted with love. Redberry offers you a chance to step back in time and revisit the way things used to be done. Here at Redberry, we make all natural fruit toppings and condiments, such as maple apple drizzle, the apple pie in a jar, and fresh whole fruits, vegetables, and spices. Our new gift shop awaits you with sights and smells that will tempt your taste buds and delight your soul at Redberry Specialty Foods and Gifts, 109 Railroad Street, downtown St. Johnsbury.
Now back to Battleship on Discovery Sunday.
Explore.
death of the Arizona, it seemed, died the battleship itself. For half a century, the universal symbol of naval pride and power. The Americans were stunned by the daring of the Japanese.
I think there was an arrogance on the part of America to understand that the Japanese were capable of these things. Mostly when you read newspapers or magazines of the period, you got the impression that the Japanese were inferior.
Japanese planning was anything but inferior. They had set a secret route across the treacherous northern Pacific and had sent the liner Tayumaru in advance to be certain no one sailed up there. In a bold effort, they raced toward Pearl Harbor, knowing that they could succeed. The sunken Arizona was thought by many to symbolize the end of an era. Today, there are no battleships on Battleship Row. Only the symbols and memories of those once great warships and of the war itself linger on. The Japanese had been planning their attack for over a year. Their war plan had been secretly but actively in operation since the fall of 1941. It included the conquest of Guam, Wake Island, Hong Kong, the Philippines, and Malaya. It began with their surprise attack on the Americans. On December 8th, just one day after the fateful and tragic attack at Pearl Harbor at the British Admiralty in London, the leadership of the Royal Navy met to debate the future deployment of its two warships, Prince of Wales and Repulse, Winston Churchill's personal choice to protect the far-flung reaches of the British Empire. It was the Prince of Wales that just 4 months earlier carried Churchill across the Atlantic for his historic face-to-face meeting with the American president. Symbolically, under the guns of the British battleship, they had signed the Atlantic Charter. Now, in the Pacific, the Prince of Wales and Repulse are the lone symbols of Britain's resolve. The question, should these two now be rushed to Pearl Harbor? The debate continues throughout December 9. At day's end, they adjourn. The decision will be taken tomorrow, December 10, 1941. But off the coast of Malaya, it already is tomorrow. As Admiralty officials sleep in London, Repulse and Prince of Wales search the sea for a Japanese landing force and are spotted from the air. As at Pearl Harbor 48 hours earlier, the combination of high-level bombers and low-flying torpedo planes is devastating. It will be the first time that aircraft will sink a battleship underway at sea. 840 British seamen lose their lives when the Prince of Wales and Repulse are both sunk.
The Prince of Wales and Repulse was very much Churchill's own miscalculation. He thought that a small, fast squadron of capital ships based in Singapore would act as a very potent deterrent to a country that he thought of as effectively a bunch of rather crude yellow men who hadn't really grasped Western technology. Nothing could have been further from the truth.
Reeling from the attack on Pearl Harbor and virtually alone in the Pacific, the United States strikes back. Her two Pearl Harbor-based aircraft carriers were at sea during the attack on December 7. By the spring of 1942, they had ravaged the Japanese fleet in the battles of the Coral Sea and Midway. At Midway alone, the Japanese lost 4 carriers and over 300 planes. Pearl Harbor had been avenged. In just 6 months, the tide of war had changed dramatically. On July 11, a battleship appears outside Pearl Harbor. She is the USS North Carolina, the first American battleship to be commissioned in 18 years. The largest, most modern of all American warships. It has taken nearly 8 years to design and build her. The North Carolina would soon be in the thick of battle. But on this day, the majority of her crew lined the decks to see the damage kept secret for 7 months. Larry Resin was a 17-year-old seaman aboard the North Carolina.
I looked out and I saw these ships with their broken backs. I saw the Arizona still tilted over, the USS Oklahoma battleship, just the bottom showing, oil all over the place. All of a sudden, there was this cheer from the men on the ships, from the shore, and I said to myself, we haven't done a thing, a damn thing, and they're cheering us.
Ken Hughes was at Pearl Harbor when the North Carolina came down the channel.
What I saw there that day was the most magnificent man of war that any of us had ever seen. This ship meant that we had people, ships, and ammunition coming out of the states that were going to be there in short order and they were going to help us survive.
The North Carolina would fight in every major campaign from Guadalcanal to the bombardment of Japan. She first saw action on 24 August 1942 while protecting the carrier Enterprise. Was remarkable, since at the time she had none of the 40mm anti-aircraft guns with which she would later be equipped. At one point, 6 dive bombers were driven off by her primitive 20mm deck guns. And by day's end, she had shot down 7 planes and assisted with 7 more.
Coming up, Allied forces march toward Japan, and the most powerful symbol of American naval strength invades Guadalcanal after the break. Now back to Battleship on Discovery Sunday.
In 1942, the North Carolina was a symbol of America's new strength in the Pacific. She would soon be joined by 6 of the 8 battleships the Japanese thought they had destroyed at Pearl Harbor. At Guadalcanal, the carriers Enterprise, Saratoga, and Wasp were joined by the North Carolina, Washington, and South Dakota. Roosevelt Flinard served aboard the North Carolina.
August 7th, 8th, and 9th, 1942, the North Carolina was a part of a task force that was invaded Guadalcanal. We began firing before daybreak, and we fired several hours. After we bombarded the island a while, then the planes came in for bombardment. We backed out.
The American carrier-based aircraft made certain that the Japanese would not reinforce their positions on the island.
Our job in the magazine was to get powder and shells up to the gun. We were sealed in. We were 3 or 4 decks down in this magazine. We would have to really work hard when there was an air attack because the 5-inch guns was shooting bam, bam, bam real fast, and we just had to get the powder up there to them.
The men shut up in the North Carolina and in other battleships during an air attack could track the Japanese planes coming closer and closer by listening to the guns. First the 5-inch, then the more rapid 40 millimeter, and finally the deck-mounted 20 millimeter as the planes that survived came within close range. Fall 1942. The battle for Guadalcanal wears on. The Japanese send one of their most powerful battleships, the Kirishima, to bombard the American air base at Henderson Field. On the nights of 14 and 15 November, between Savo Island and Guadalcanal, the battleships Washington and South Dakota engage in a gun duel at point-blank range with the Japanese force. The South Dakota is severely damaged, and the 4 American destroyers accompanying the 2 battleships are disabled in 20 minutes. The destroyer Preston took several direct hits before she sank. Her combat cameraman, Robert Reed, was thrown into the water. For nearly 3 hours, he watched the action.
It was a duel between the Washington and the Kirishima. The Kirishima was outgunned. Her 14-inchers could not penetrate the Washington's steel-armored belt. The 16-inchers of the Washington did penetrate the 14-inch belt of the Kirishima and spelled her doom. She apparently burned and exploded until she finally went down, according to the battle reports, around 3 a.m. or 3:30.
Throughout 1943, the Allied offensive grows ever stronger. American technology and training overwhelm the enemy. In the fall, the Allies begin the Central Pacific Campaign, a march through the Japanese-held atolls north of the equator, only 750 miles from the enemy homeland. Part of the American effort will rest with a new class of battleships, the Iowa class. The Americans had long been wary of Japanese plans in the Pacific. When 4 years before Pearl Harbor, Japan began to build 3 large battleships, the United States increased the size of its battleships to 45,000 tons, their guns to 16 inches. The result was a new class of battleship named for the first of their kind, the USS Iowa. More than 5 years in design and construction, the Iowa and the Missouri would be built in the New York Navy Yard, the New Jersey and Wisconsin in Philadelphia. Up to 10,000 people had a hand in the construction of each ship. The Missouri alone required 3 million man-days of work. In recognition of the threat from enemy aircraft, the 4 Iowa-class ships had been designed with an emphasis on the protection of their turrets, machinery, and magazines against aerial bombs. The heaviest armor was more than 6 inches thick. 2 huge belts along the sides were angled inboard to provide protection equal to 13.5 inches of steel. The plates that were locked together to make up the belts weighed 50 tons each. The huge crane was at its limit as it positioned them to be welded in place. Because all of the Iowas entered service late in the war, each was equipped with the newest technology, including surface and air search radar that could track enemy aircraft 100 miles away. Each of the 3 turrets on an Iowa-class ship contained 3 of the newest 16-inch guns, the most powerful guns ever mounted on a U.S. warship. With its improved range, an armor-piercing shell from one of the new 16-inch guns was said to be capable of penetrating 32 feet of reinforced concrete. The Iowas had the greatest anti-aircraft capability of any ship in World War II. Their secondary armament included 25-inch guns in 10 twin mounts and 130 smaller anti-aircraft guns. They were fast, and they could cruise great distances without refueling. Their top speed was 33 knots, the fastest battleships in the world. And their range at 12 knots was an incredible 18,000 miles. The new battleships were run by crews of over 2,000 men. The Iowa-class battleships would see action in the Pacific in the closing months of World War II. By 1944, in the Philippine Sea, the fast carriers fighter planes, supported by the battleship's anti-aircraft fire, were destroying the heart of Japanese naval aviation. Now the Americans begin to feel the extent of Japan's desperation. Naval historian Paul Stilwell.
In the autumn of 1944, as the Americans got into the Philippines, the Japanese were so desperate in their defensive stance that they inaugurated the Corps of Kamikazes, planes flown by men who were in effect human fire control systems for the bombs they carried. They were deliberately willing to sacrifice their lives because of the code of the warrior that said dying for the emperor was the highest honor.
Explore. Up next, kamikaze missions. Thousands of Japanese pilots sacrificed their lives in an attempt to save Japan when Discovery Sunday continues. Now back to Battleship on Discovery Sunday. Explore.
On 24 October, a force of 259 carrier-based American bombers and torpedo planes attacked 4 of Japan's largest battleships in the Saboyan Sea. The American pilots concentrate on Musashi as she falls behind the others. After 9 hours of unrelenting punishment, the great Japanese man-of-war, ravaged by 20 torpedoes and 10 bombs, rolls over and sinks. Oil and debris from the Musashi still float on the water the next day when a Japanese fleet of 4 destroyers, a cruiser, and 2 battleships steam through a narrow strait called Surigao. The Japanese are unaware that at the north end of the strait, the Americans have assembled 8 cruisers, 26 destroyers, and 6 battleships. It is a textbook trap. Ed Snyder was at Surigao Strait.
We had very good intelligence which indicated to us which way the forces had to come. This forced the Japanese forces carrying the amphibious attack, led by some battleships, to come up through a strait, a very narrow strait, so narrow that the battleships could not turn. They had to stay within the channel.
I, as gunnery officer, was tracking the Japanese lead battleship through the optics of the rangefinder, which in effect was a sight. I had it in the crosshairs, and it suddenly occurred to me that that the pagoda-like mast of this Japanese ship was absolutely filling the optics, and we were that close. And as I recall thinking, my God, that looks just like the pagoda mast of a Japanese battleship that I learned about in recognition class back at the Naval Academy. And then I thought, well, that's exactly what it is. And it's shooting back at us.
It was at Surigao Strait that battleships last used the classic formation of crossing the T. Crossing the T is a maneuver invented over a century and a half ago. By coming across the enemy's bow, battleships could fire broadsides while the enemy could only fire their forward guns. As Surigao Strait, the Americans crossed the T on the Japanese.
We saw these tracers going through the sky, and they were coming from our battleships and all converging on the Japanese battleships. The battleships that we had backing us up, the Maryland, the California, the West Virginia, the Pennsylvania, the Mississippi, and the Tennessee. What poetic justice that these ships that were sunk at Pearl Harbor are going to go into action against Japanese battleships.
Admiral Yamamoto was wrong to think that he could destroy the American resolve. He was right when he said, "I fear we have awakened a sleeping giant."
We must remember that Surigao Strait was the last major surface action between battleships. It's probably the last surface action between any kinds of ships that did not involve aircraft.
4 months after the Battle of Surigao Strait, America's great battleships are called upon once again. This time, the assignment is the shelling of the Japanese-held island of Iwo Jima. Larry Resin was aboard the North Carolina.
When they fire the main battery, that's the 16-inch guns where the projectiles are about as tall as I am. If they fire 9 of them at once, 2 things happen. Once, the recoil actually slides the ship sideways in the water. That's a lot of movement. But the other thing, especially in my battle station, you get a sucking out of the air in your lungs. I mean, the vacuum created by the projectiles taking off creates a vacuum.
In March of 1945, only the island of Okinawa stood between the Allies and the Japanese mainland. And Okinawa was fiercely defended. For the Americans and for the Japanese, the battle for Okinawa would be the most costly action of the Pacific War. 75,000 Japanese, 13,000 Americans, and 150,000 Okinawan civilians would be lost. America's battleships were there to prepare the way. The North Carolina and the other 3 ships of the Iowa class, Missouri, Wisconsin, and New Jersey, joined the older but still highly accurate New Mexico and Tennessee. The Allied landings began on Easter Sunday, 1 April 1945. They were accompanied by massive bombardments from the battleships. With the defense of Okinawa, the Japanese unleashed Operation 10 Go, the largest, most concentrated kamikaze campaign yet.
As I'm looking through these binoculars, which are huge binoculars called the eyes on the signal bridge, and I'm looking at this plane coming down as I see the shells coming out forward all around, and then all of a sudden I look in the side of the cockpit and I see the pilot. I see his fixed eyes. And then all of a sudden the wings come off, the explosions occur, the engine evidently catches on fire, and the pilot, with blood ringing down his face, leans over and slumps, meaning he's dead. That the plane still keeps coming like a ballistic missile straight at you, straight down. Very fortunately, it missed us by about 100 yards.
Operation 10 Go was truly a massive suicide campaign. The Americans had never seen anything like it. Thousands of young pilots eager to die as human bombs, believing they were part of a divine wind. Thousands of kamikaze planes were shot out of the sky by carrier-based fighters and anti-aircraft fire from the battleships. Still, there were others that found their mark. 33 American ships and 5,000 men were lost to kamikaze attacks during Operation 10 Go. But perhaps the greatest kamikaze mission of all time involved not aircraft, but a battleship, the largest, most fearsome battleship ever built. 4 years before the attack on Pearl Harbor, the design for a new and massive battleship was secretly being tank tested in Japan's Kure shipyard. She would be called Yamato, the oldest and most sacred name with which the Japanese referred to their island nation. And she would be the largest, most powerful battleship ever built. A huge roof covered the behemoth. When trains moved past the construction, attendants drew the curtains to cut off the view. Under a shroud of secrecy, the great ship took shape. Nearly 23,000 tons of her total weight was in her armor, a record that has never been equaled. Her largest guns were over 18 inches in diameter, and one single turret weighed more than a heavy destroyer. She carried 12 6-inch and 12 5-inch guns in her secondary battery and bristled with 152 25-millimeter anti-aircraft guns. Her watertight compartments and hundreds of design innovations made her the most glorious symbol of Japanese naval supremacy. But it would all be in vain. 6 April 1945. The battleship Yamato and 9 support vessels steam out of the port of Kure into the East China Sea. She's completely armed, but carries only enough fuel for a one-way trip to Okinawa. Ceremonial sake and prayers are offered to the 2,500-man crew. For this is to be the ultimate kamikaze mission. Yamato is to be sacrificed as the Imperial Navy's face-saving in the final battle of the war. This most powerful battleship of all time is to be run aground, her great guns used as field artillery. At sea, the Americans are waiting. The Suicide Task Force is spotted by a single Grumman Hellcat out 240 miles from his base aboard the carrier Essex. The first wave of planes is ordered into the air. There are 9 American carriers in position. The battleship Yamato will feel the full fury of their bombs and torpedoes. Helldivers, Avengers, Hellcats. Over 400 of them. Even more planes than the Japanese had unleashed at Pearl Harbor. Yamato went down with 2,498 Japanese officers and men. The only record of her final moments are these primitive combat photographs. But one can imagine such horror by recalling the death of another invincible battleship, HMS Barham, when a motion picture camera was there. The mushroom cloud from the Yamato was said to rise so high in the air that it was visible from the Japanese mainland 50 miles away. Yamato had become the symbolic funeral pyre of the Empire of Japan.
Explore. Coming up, it was the first ultimate weapon, the HMS Dreadnought, when Discovery Sunday continues. Now back to Battleship on Discovery Sunday. Explore.
For 50 years, the battleship had been the world's ultimate weapon, national policy represented by the threat of her powerful guns. The road to 2 world wars began with the creation of the first modern battleship. Work began in 1905 on an entirely new generation of battleships called Dreadnought. HMS Dreadnought would be the heaviest, fastest warship afloat. Her firepower was concentrated in 10 12-inch guns. To protect her magazine, she was wrapped with armor plate 11 inches thick. Below her waterline, 18 watertight compartments made her unsinkable. She carried torpedoes and was the first major warship to run on steam turbines, her 8 engines propelling her at an unprecedented 21.6 knots. Dreadnought changed everything. In America, Japan, and Germany, new battleships already approved were rushed into construction. The word dreadnought became synonymous with the new and more powerful battleships. Amazingly, one of Dreadnought's near contemporaries survives to this day. She is the battleship Texas, launched in 1912. Moored along the Gulf Coast near Houston, the Texas stands as a monument to the thousands of battleship sailors who served with her from 1914 through 2 world wars. The guns on the Texas were controlled by primitive computers. Armor plate on her sides was a full 12 inches thick. Each turret was manned by 24 sailors who lived and worked in dark, cramped quarters. The Texas reminds us of the primitive conditions aboard the first modern battleship. Steve Nelson is an historian and head curator of the Texas.
What makes the USS Texas so similar to HMS Dreadnought are these big guns. Now, these are 14-inch guns. The Dreadnought had 12-inch guns. And the way these guns worked was that 2 crew members had to man this loading ramp, drop that down into position. The 14-inch shell was rammed all the way up the breech. 400 pounds of powder was placed in behind the shell. The crew had to grab the ramp again, making sure that it breaks in the middle, closing up. The breech was closed. The crew had to jump into tight confined spaces like this, buckle themselves in, and communicate with their crew members through this voice tube, ready to fire.
Ironically, Dreadnought would never fire her great guns in anger. Yet, within the decade, her existence would propel the world into war. June 28, 1914. The Archduke of Austria and his wife are assassinated by anarchists. The world explodes into war. German submarines attack British merchant shipping. Then on May 30, 1916, the German fleet steams to sea for its first confrontation with England's Grand Fleet. The decade-long arms race approaches Armageddon. The dreadnoughts meet off the coast of the Danish peninsula called Jutland. 250 warships fight the greatest sea battle the world has ever seen. When it is over, 25 ships have been sunk, 8,465 men killed, over 1,000 wounded. John Semita is an historian and authority on the Battle of Jutland, as is Eric Grove. They are at Admiralty headquarters on London's Pall Mall.
The problem to the people who sat in this room was that the battle had not succeeded in gaining the crucial objective, the destruction of the high sea fleet.
The battle did succeed in proving that the dreadnoughts were vulnerable. The German reaction was to keep her battleships in port for the remainder of the war. The British had failed to win an overwhelming victory at Jutland because the success of their big guns at long distances in the smoke and haze was only 2 or 3% of hits to shots fired.
The problem for the Royal Navy at the Battle of Jutland was her battle fleet was prepared before the war for a battle that was going to take place at much lower ranges.
The British were working on a system of firing battleship guns at very long ranges. It was based on the work of Arthur Hungerford Pollen, who created a primitive computer before the word computer had been invented.
Holland developed the idea of using very advanced rangefinders that were gyroscopically stabilized against the motion of his own ship, a very advanced analog computer, very advanced systems of transmitting the calculations of that computer to the guns.
The pollen system would have greatly improved accuracy, but was too expensive and was rejected by the Admiralty. They'd been informed by their intelligence that the Germans intended to fight at very short ranges. Their intelligence was dead wrong. In the closing days of World War I in the Adriatic Sea, an Italian speedboat fires its torpedoes at 2 Austrian dreadnoughts. A combat cameraman aboard the Tagetov watches as 2 milky white tracks head for the St. Stephen. These pictures document the first sinking of a battleship by a simple torpedo exploding below her armor belt, where she was to prove as vulnerable as any other ship. The primitive camera grinds on as nearly 1,000 men are lost. Days later, the war is over. The Allies and their defeated foe gather to set the terms of peace at Versailles. And as Germany's captured high seas fleet makes its way through internment at the Scapa Flow naval anchorage north of Scotland, a secret plan to seal its fate is already in place. On the morning of June 21, 1919, German sailors aboard their captured ships carry out their orders, scuttling 51 vessels, including their prized battleships, rather than hand them over to England as prizes of war. Their rotting remains still litter the bottom of Scapa Flow. As the new decade gets underway, disarmament is the mood of the day, and the worldwide focus of attention is on the battleship, that single most expensive symbol of a nation's military strength. The cry for the destruction of these major weapons and the distribution of the peace dividend into social programs is not unlike the mood that swept America after the Cold War. In the spring of 1921, Brigadier General of the Army Billy Mitchell learns the Navy is preparing to bomb the captured German battleship Ostfriesland as part of its ongoing tests of air power versus sea power. For Mitchell, air power is an idea whose time has come. He fervently believes that the airplane will make armies and navies obsolete. July 19, 1921 is an auspicious day. Billy Mitchell has gathered 50 correspondents and 300 dignitaries to observe the events as the military band begins the festivities at Virginia's Langley Field. The crowd watches throughout the day. Mitchell's pilots drop bomb after bomb, but damage is minimal. The next day, Mitchell's Martin bombers are equipped with 2,000-pound ship killer bombs. They are the biggest bombs in the world. Today, they will find their mark. Some are set to explode 30 feet beneath the surface of the water, as if multiple torpedoes are striking the ship from below, where she carries no protective armor. Finally, the Ostfriesland slips beneath the waters of the Chesapeake just 21 minutes after the day's work began. Air power has met the battleship head-on, and it's been a bad day for the Navy. And so, in the fall of 1921, with Mitchell's triumph as prologue, the international disarmament conferences begin in Washington. When the meetings are over, guns on all existing warships are limited to 14 inches and displacement to 35,000 tons. No new battleships are to be built for 10 years. Others must be destroyed. France is given equality in tonnage with Italy, as is Britain with the United States. Germany is to be kept inferior to everyone, including the Japanese, who are angered when they are forced to accept a battleship strength well below Britain and America. Some will later say, on the day the conference ended, World War II began. Soon, Japan and Germany would embark upon the path of rearmament and conquest. Within 2 decades, the world will once again be at war. And once again, the battleship will play a major part. It is 1939. Adolf Hitler has overrun Eastern Europe. And at sea, German U-boats once again prey on Britain's merchant fleet. Nazi surface raiders capture crews, then sink their ships. One such raider is the German battleship Admiral Graf Spee. Her captain, Hans Langsdorff, is a veteran of the First World War. He is known for his humane leadership. In the past year, he has destroyed 9 merchant ships without the loss of a single life. Now, in the closing weeks of 1939, Hitler dispatches Langsdorff to intercept British cargo vessels off the coast of Uruguay.
He was going to the River Plate to find a convoy that he would sink together with the escort, and he had been given the strictest of orders that the last thing a German raider should do was engage British warships.
But for some unknown reason, Langsdorff disobeys. Perhaps he thinks any British warships in the area will be small and easily sunk. Aboard the British cruiser Ajax, Commodore Henry Harwood has been hunting the Graf Spee for months. Now he guesses exactly where Langsdorff is heading, and with the 2 other cruisers under his command, HMS Exeter and Achilles, he steams to intercept. On the Graf Spee, Langsdorff sights the masts of Exeter, thinks she is alone, and opens fire. The Battle of the River Plate has begun. The Graf Spee's gunnery is superb. Exeter is hit first, then Ajax. Still, Harwood manages to direct the Ajax's guns on the Graf Spee. Exeter fires her torpedoes. The Germans must turn hard to avoid them and thereby leave the field of battle. Langsdorff orders the Graf Spee to the neutral harbor at Montevideo. He pleads for time to make repairs, but the Uruguayan authorities refuse. The ship is badly damaged, and her captain has received 2 head wounds. The Graf Spee must leave in 72 hours. Langsdorff radios Berlin for instructions. At 5:25 on Sunday afternoon, 17 December 1939, this wounded symbol of Hitler's Navy weighs anchor and heads to sea. Outside the harbor, the British warships wait. A huge crowd has assembled to watch the battle to come. But there will be no battle. Just beyond the 3-mile limit, the battleship turns west and anchors. Captain Langsdorff and his officers depart the ship to find safe haven in Buenos Aires. Shortly afterward, explosions racked the Graf Spee. Two days later, alone in his hotel room, Langsdorff commits suicide.
Explore. Coming up, Hitler's Bismarck destroys the HMS Hood, but Britain strikes back with a vengeance after the break. Now back to Battleship on Discovery Sunday. Explore.
July 1940, in London, Prime Minister Winston Churchill confronts a new crisis. France has fallen to the Nazis. The fate of her navy is yet to be determined. Churchill forbids French ships in British ports to put to sea. He dispatches a powerful squadron of warships to confront what remains of the French force in the Mediterranean at a place called Mirs el Kabir, Algeria. It is an impressive show of British sea power. Two 35,000-ton battleships, the carrier Ark Royal, and leading the squadron, Britain's ultimate symbol of naval supremacy, the battle cruiser HMS Hood. At 42,000 tons with 8 15-inch guns, the Hood is considered the most powerful warship in the world. At 32 knots, she is also among the fastest. Aboard the Hood, in command of the British Strike Force, is Vice Admiral James Somerville. He anchors his flotilla at Gibraltar and prepares to send his emissary, Cedric Holland, to reason with the French Admiral, Marcel Gensoul. In a final briefing to his officers aboard the Hood, Somerville is grave. I am ordered to inform the French. They must either bring their ships to British harbors and fight with us, steam with reduced crews through a British port and demilitarize their ships immediately, or scuttle them. Should the French be unwilling, we must then destroy the French ships. For 2 days, Holland travels back and forth between Gensoul and Somerville. The Admiral is immovable. If he accepts any of the British options, he will betray his word to the Germans and France will be punished. And so shortly after noon on July 3, 1940, the Hood trains her guns on the port of Mirs el Kabir, where 4 French battleships and a collection of auxiliary vessels lie defiantly at anchor. France and England have not fired a shot at each other in 125 years. The British battleships open fire. In just 10 minutes, 3 French battleships and a destroyer are out of commission. Churchill has called it the deadly stroke. When it is over, 1,290 men of the French Navy are dead. 1,000 more have been wounded. The French Admiral presides over the mass burial. He says, if there is a stain on the flag, it is certainly not on ours. Aboard the Hood, Admiral Somerville writes to his wife, we all feel thoroughly dirty and ashamed. I think it was the biggest political blunder of modern times. Control of the Mediterranean was an essential element of the British war plan in 1940. On 11 November, just 4 months after the attack on Mirs el Kabir, the British carrier Illustrious maneuvers into position. For the first time in naval history, the British will attempt a surprise attack by carrier-based aircraft against an enemy naval base. Their target, the Italian port of Taranto. Their bombs and torpedoes wreak havoc on the ships of Mussolini's fleet. Word of the mission's unqualified success catches the attention of the top-ranking officer in the United States Navy, Admiral Harold Stark. He is concerned that what happened to the Italian fleet at Taranto could easily happen to the American fleet secluded in Pearl Harbor. Admiral Stark sounds the alarm, which goes largely unheeded in Washington. But not in Tokyo. On hearing the news from Taranto, the commander-in-chief of Japan's combined fleet, Admiral Yamamoto, turns to his chief of staff and says, an air attack on Pearl Harbor might be possible now, especially as our air training has turned out so successfully. Spring 1941. The Japanese continue their aggression in Indochina and sign a war pact with Germany. Most of Europe is under the Nazi boot. Hitler is pleased with his new Japanese ally as he presides over the launch of Germany's newest, most formidable weapon, the battleship Bismarck. The ship is referred to as he, in deference both to its namesake, the great Prussian Chancellor, and the masculine warrior tasks for which it was created. On one speed trial in the Baltic, he reaches 30.8 knots. The ship boasts 8 15-inch guns and a sophisticated fire control system. Bismarck's armor consumes 40% of the ship's weight. The battleship is the perfect symbol for the Third Reich. And yet, Bismarck is far too valuable to place in harm's way. Its mission is to hunt enemy merchant ships, as do the other German raiders. On May 19, 1941, Bismarck steams to sea on its maiden voyage. Even before Hitler learns of its departure, the British are tracking Bismarck's progress. 4 days later, the battleship is located by the superior radar of the heavy cruiser Suffolk. Now the Royal Navy knows Bismarck is on the move, racing for the North Atlantic. HMS Hood and Prince of Wales are dispatched to intercept. By 5:45 on the morning of 24 May, the Hood and Prince of Wales have closed within 13 miles of Bismarck. Hood fires first. Bismarck immediately returns fire. The first shells strike the Hood's fused torpedoes at midships, and she explodes. Of the ship's total company of 1,419, 3 survivors cling to life rafts in the icy water. Only one, Sigelman Ted Briggs, is alive today.
I felt myself being dragged down, and I was trying to get away. And the next thing I knew was I suddenly seemed to shoot to the surface. When I came up, there wasn't another soul inside. I looked around, and she was about 50 yards away, and she was vertical with the water. And the B turret was just going under. I panicked, and I turned and swam as fast as I could away from her. And when I looked around again, she'd gone. She was a beautiful, proud ship, but unfortunately, with a glass jaw.
HMS Hood's glass jaw was a function of her design. Armor had been sacrificed for speed. The next day, the victorious Bismarck, a hole in its bow from a shell fired from Prince of Wales, is short on fuel and heads directly for France.
Ships right across the Atlantic converged towards the likely area of Bismarck, in some cases without orders. They had to find Bismarck. They were going to sink that ship, one way or another.
26 May, 1941, 10:30 a.m. A Catalina flying boat dives through the clouds for a better look at a huge ship below. It is met with a hail of gunfire from the Bismarck, trailing oil at 20 knots, less than 12 hours from freedom in France. But only 50 miles away is the British carrier Ark Royal. Within minutes, 15 of the Ark Royal's swordfish are in the air. Most of their torpedoes will miss, but one jams the Bismarck's rudder and plants the seeds of its destruction. Royal Navy battleships will finish the job.
Bismarck died under very severe bombardment whilst shot to pieces at close range. It was very bloody, and nearly 2,000 men died. It was a human tragedy. A very stout ship, slow death, hammered to pieces.
In less than half an hour, the greatest German warship of all time rolls over and sinks. The victim of 400 shells, 15 well-placed torpedoes, and British resolve to revenge the Hood. By the fall of 1945, after more than 6 years of the fiercest fighting the world has ever seen, all of Germany's battleships have been sunk, and Japan's monster battleship, her last hope for victory, is also at the bottom of the sea. World War II is over.
Explore. Coming up, the Japanese surrender, and history is made on the deck of the Missouri when Discovery Sunday continues. Now back to Battleship on Discovery Sunday.
The once mighty empire of Japan lies in ruin. President Harry Truman from Missouri prepares for peace.
I have received this afternoon a message from the Japanese government.
He has determined that the unconditional surrender of Japan will take place most symbolically upon the deck of the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The Americans have come back to Japan to anchor very near the spot where in 1853 Commodore Matthew Perry anchored to demand that the Japanese open their nation to the West. The events of the day will be carefully documented. 170 reporters, photographers, and radio soundmen swarm the decks of the USS Missouri to record sounds and images that will be seen around the world for years to come. To this day, the battleship Missouri remains the most historic of all American battleships. For naval historian and battleship veteran Paul Stilwell, the Missouri is an heroic symbol, for on her deck, one era ended and another began.
And so it was on September 2nd, 1945, that General Douglas MacArthur came to this ladder at 9:01 on that Sunday morning while the Japanese were waiting for him to come down and accept the surrender of a proud but defeated nation. As the general walked forward, on his left was an American flag flown out from Annapolis for the ceremony. It had been on board Commodore Matthew Perry's flagship in Tokyo Bay in 1853. Farther to the left were dozens of American officers wearing khaki. The Japanese ahead of him were in top hats and morning coats. The Japanese looked up to this towering superstructure and saw hundreds of pairs of eyes boring down at them. There was an eerie silence on board the deck of the Missouri as General MacArthur came to the end of his walk. Standing just about here, his hand trembling slightly, at 9:02, he began a short speech looking beyond the war.
We are gathered here to conclude a solemn agreement.
At 9:04, Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu signed on behalf of the Japanese nation. Then the military representative. Then General MacArthur signed for the Allied powers. Finally, one by one, the representatives of the Allies came forward.
Whereby these proceedings are closed.
And so, on board a battleship, ended the greatest war in human history. Today, the Missouri remains the pinnacle of battleship design and technology. Still ready, it would seem, for another fight or yet another symbolic mission. On that infamous Sunday morning in 1941, Japan had sought to destroy every one of America's battleships in a single stroke. Yet here on the deck of a battleship, they surrendered without condition to the overwhelming force of the United States and her allies. The living symbol of that force remains the battleship Missouri. Missouri Captain Lee Case.
She is a ship with a heart and a soul. And the soul of the ship has always been and always will be the past, present, and future sailors that serve on her.
In peace and war, the tradition of the American battleship sailor grew large, enhanced by competition of every kind. They were like rival schools cheering on their own. Battleship sailors have long been a special breed, perhaps because of the extraordinary teamwork required to man the guns and fight the ship, or the special symbolic nature of a battleship, or simply because they knew they were aboard the Navy's best. Their ship became their home, and their home was a matter of pride. Between 1920 and 1941, America's fleet included up to 18 battleships that cruised the oceans of the world to train their crews and fly the flag. a powerful symbol that the American Navy was a genuine deterrent to any would-be aggressor. And among those pre-war American battleships was the USS North Carolina. Today, she rests as a state memorial in Wilmington, honoring the more than 10,000 North Carolinians who fought and died in World War II.
Welcome to the USS North Carolina.
A visit aboard the North Carolina is a visit back in time.
And as you begin it, let us tell you something about this giant of a ship. Wish it.
The North Carolina's engines could drive the ship at 27 knots, 6 knots faster than any previous American battleship. Here rest the 9 great guns of her main battery, fired 2,396 times in 9 operations by crews that often worked around the clock in the suffocating heat of the Pacific. Captain Dave Shoy is executive director of the North Carolina Memorial. He explains how the crew worked the guns.
This is the lower projectile flat from where the crew would take the chosen type of ammunition, be it the 2,700-pound armor-piercing or the 1,900-pound high-capacity projectile, and raise it up to the gun house to be placed in the barrel.
Each steel barrel weighs 96 tons and can be loaded in 30 seconds.
The first projectile is already in place to be raised up to the gun house. Once this projectile is clear, the next projectile is slid into place.
A full 9-gun broadside of armor-piercing projectiles delivers a total weight of 24,000 pounds and can penetrate more than 20 inches of the strongest hardened steel.
For every projectile, it takes 6 90-pound powder bags. The crews down here will take the bags out of the tanks, put them on the conveyor belt. From here, they're passed one at a time to the powder flat, and then 6 of them together are going to be raised up to the gun. The projectile, when the transfer tray lays down, is then rammed into the barrel. In the second phase, the first 3 bags of powder come out of the hoist and are separated, and then the second 3 bags are rolled into place. In the third phase, the 6 bags of powder would then be rammed into the barrel, the primer attached to the last powder bag, the breech closed, and the gun is ready to fire.
The shells are hurtled over 2,000 feet per second as the gun recoils on itself, a distance of 4 feet. At a range of nearly 20 miles with the guns at maximum elevation, the trajectory is 7 miles high and the projectile becomes an armor-piercing bomb. To hit a moving target from a ship which itself is moving, pitching, and rolling requires a complex system of fire control. Deep below deck is the North Carolina's plotting room and the ship's analog computers. These primitive yet rugged computers, called range keepers, and their electrical switchboards control the guns. The gun is aimed not at the target, but where the target will be when the projectile gets there. Linked to the controlling range keeper is a gyroscopically operated device called the stable vertical. The guns actually remain stable and can be aimed with great accuracy while the ship rolls and pitches beneath them. The 5-inch guns were controlled by the same kind of computers or range keepers as the 16-inch guns, but loading was a manual operation. Today, visitors relive what it was like to serve aboard such a ship. In passageways and living spaces below the main deck, thousands of battleship sailors made their home in ships like the North Carolina. They slept and ate and worked and played and worked. Galley served up 3 meals a day and then some. There was a store and a post office. And on a battleship, there was ice cream at the soda fountain. There was a newspaper, a tailor, and a cobbler. And always there were decks to polish. Although the North Carolina came home to stay, others would soon return to the battle line in defense of freedom.
Explore. Coming up, the battleship returns to the sea. In Korea and Vietnam, the gigantic guns challenge the enemy after the break. Now back to Battleship on Discovery Sunday. Explore.
Sunday, 25 June 1950, 6 divisions of the North Korean Army, spearheaded by over 100 Soviet-built tanks, crossed the 38th parallel to invade South Korea. The United States, through the United Nations, is committed to defend South Korea. But what remains of America's once great battleships rests in mothballs. Only the Missouri, the last battleship commissioned by the United States Navy, is still at sea. From 1948 to 1950, the world's most famous battleship was at sea as a training ship. When North Korean troops marched into South Korea, she was quickly ordered back to Norfolk to be loaded with supplies and live ammunition. The Missouri would be going back to work as a battleship. In time, she would be joined by her 3 sisters of the Iowa class, the Iowa, Wisconsin, and New Jersey. All 4 reactivated from mothballs for wartime duties to protect the fast carriers and bombard North Korean positions ashore. September 1950, the battleship Missouri has fought through 2 hurricanes, arriving too late for support of the American invasion at Incheon. Now, equipped with a helicopter for spotting, her big guns speak once again. Just before Christmas 1950, the Communist Chinese came into the war on the side of the North Koreans. 7 Chinese divisions converged on a single division of American Marines at Chosin Reservoir. The Marines fought their way to the tiny port city of Hungnam. The Missouri was there. Lee Royal was aboard.
We fired night and day. It was a warning to the Chinese and North Koreans not to interfere with the Marines coming off the beach.
Hungnam was in flames. The American Marines, along with North Korean civilians, their goats and chickens, had escaped. The last of the UN soldiers had set charges in the ammunition dump to keep it from the approaching Chinese. As the Missouri weighed anchor to leave the harbor, the earth shook with a gigantic explosion. While the Missouri was steaming in Korean waters, her sister ship, the New Jersey, was being recommissioned. By May, she was stationed off the North Korean port city of Kansong. At 5 in the morning of May 20, the guns of the New Jersey were fired in anger for the first time since 1945. After 6 months of operations off the coast of Korea, the New Jersey is relieved by her sister ship, the Wisconsin. And for 6 months in 1952 by the Iowa. Before the war is over, all 4 Iowa-class battleships will have seen action in Korean waters. After Korea, there were diplomatic cruises, training missions, and NATO maneuvers. But in November 1957, the Wisconsin completed her final cruise and followed her 3 Iowa-class sisters into the mothball fleet. For the first time since the 1890s, the United States was without even one active battleship. Throughout the first half of the politically charged 1960s, America became increasingly involved in a war in Southeast Asia. Perhaps a battleship could save American lives. But the battleships of the Iowa class slept in mothballs. Then, in 1967, the word came down: bring back the New Jersey. Within months, she would be guided into dry dock at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, where her great hull would leave the water for the first time in a decade. The men of the shipyard had done this job before, some of them when she was first built in the early 1940s. From scaffolding high in the superstructure and in spaces below, the men of the Philadelphia yard would bring the ship back to life, updating her electronics for the Navy of the 1960s. Finally, after nearly a year of work, the reborn New Jersey steams triumphantly to sea. On September 29, 1968, the world's only active battleship arrived off the coast of Da Nang, South Vietnam, ready for work. Captain of the New Jersey at the time was the colorful J. Edward Snyder.
The commanding officer of the field hospital said that he was taking incoming. Incoming means that the North Vietnamese were shelling his hospital while they were trying to do operations. And would I consider lobbing a shell over his hospital just for the heck of it to try to see if that would stop them? And I said, well, I'd be perfectly willing to do that. Let me take a look at what the situation is. And, of course, one of my officers said, you can't fire over your own troops. And I said, they're not troops, they're the hospital. He said, well, that's worse. I said, oh, shut up, we're going to do it anyhow. So we would stand up there, and between the hours of 1 o'clock and 3 o'clock in the morning, fire randomly 2 shells directly over the hospital and have the explosion go several thousand yards over the hospital. And not one time during the 30 days we did that did the hospital take incoming from the Vietnamese.
Explore. Coming up, the battleship is reborn with modern technology and supports the ground troops of the Gulf War when Discovery Sunday continues. Now back to Battleship on Discovery Sunday.
Explore. By June of 1969, the New Jersey was back home in friendly waters. And only 6 months later, on a damp and chilly day in Bremerton, Washington, an old story was being repeated once again. For the second time, the New Jersey had been consigned to the mothball fleet. By 1981, America had a new president, and Ronald Reagan's Secretary of the Navy, John Lehman, had new ideas to build an enlarged fleet organized around aircraft carriers and recommissioned Iowa-class battleships. By summer, President Reagan had signed the new defense legislation, and all 4 of the Iowa-class ships were on their way back. They would be transformed, modernized with the very latest of weaponry. No longer would their offensive action be limited to the range of their historic 16-inch guns. 8 box launchers for 32 Tomahawk cruise missiles with a range of 1,500 miles, and 4 quadruple canister launchers for 16 close-in Harpoon anti-ship missiles were mounted in the superstructures. 4 Vulcan Phalanx weapon systems would provide defense against enemy aircraft and incoming missiles. New communication systems, air search radar, and improved living spaces equipped the Iowas for the 1980s. To replace and refit what was required of the original equipment, no longer manufactured, the Navy secured tons of items from America's museum battleships, the North Carolina, Alabama, and Massachusetts. The 1982 recommissioning of the New Jersey cost $326 million, more than 3 times what it cost to build her in 1941. But to Secretary Lehman, intent on creating a new Navy, symbolic of America's status as a world power, she was more than worth it. By 1983, the New Jersey is bright and new once again. She cruises as the centerpiece of a new battle group. She is part of a peacekeeping force off the coast of Lebanon. For 6 months, she cruises the coast and shells Syrian gun positions ashore. In time, she is joined at sea by the USS Iowa and her sister ships, Missouri and Wisconsin.
Ralston, what do you have on Skunk about 5 degrees off the port bow?
Yes, sir. It's Skunk India, bearing 255, 21,000. Course 075.
Evaluator, I have an update on the Kenda.
Very well.
All stations report ready for call for fire. All stations report ready to call for fire.
Report ready to call. On a routine training mission in the spring of 1989, as the crew of the Iowa prepares to fire the center 16-inch gun in number 2 turret, something goes terribly wrong. 47 sailors are killed in a tragedy that to this day has not been fully explained. And as the Cold War comes to an end the next year, the Iowa and her sister, the New Jersey, are again to be decommissioned. Only the Wisconsin and Missouri continue to cruise and train with the modern Navy, flying the flag, awaiting the day when they too will be returned to mothballs, sold as scrap, or converted as museums. No one yet realized that America's 2 remaining battleships would soon fight their 3rd war. Perhaps their final war. In Operation Desert Storm, the battleship was once again an integral part of the American strike force. From their decks, Tomahawk cruise missiles were launched at targets up to 800 miles away in Iraq and Kuwait. They were so accurate and destructive that eventually the coalition ran out of targets. No hostile fire ever reached the battleships. The relentless bombardment from their 16-inch guns helped pave the way as the troops of the coalition entered Kuwait City unopposed. And all the while, the battleship sailors aboard their ships watched their success, as did the rest of the world. On the 6th of March, the Wisconsin departs the Persian Gulf. The Missouri heads for home on the 21st. They will sail into a post-Cold War world of military downsizing and critics who still remember the tragic explosion aboard the Iowa. By September, the Wisconsin has been decommissioned and the Missouri's days are growing shorter. But she will make one last symbolic and ceremonial voyage. She is going back to observe the anniversary of the event that plunged America into World War II. Paul Stilwell.
One morning in early December 1991, it was my privilege to be here on board the battleship Missouri as she steamed in the Pearl Harbor Channel for the last time. As we went in on the port side were the mooring quays where the battleships had been in December 1941 when the Japanese attacked. And in my mind's eye, I could see the smoke and the flame billowing up where hundreds of American sailors were killed.
The past and present intertwine in the memories of young and old. 50 years ago to the day, their thoughts float back to that Sunday morning when many thought the era of the battleship had come to an end. For the Missouri, symbol of all the great battleships of the Second World War, it has been a journey back in time. The next chapter in her long life can now begin. March 31, 1992, the Long Beach Naval Shipyard. Her equipment inactivated, her compartment stripped of every usable item. The world's last active battleship is to be decommissioned. She seems but a symbol of past glories, the last of her breed of thoroughbreds. For 100 years, they changed the world into which they had been born. Dreadnought began an arms race that never seemed to cease. To this day, major powers still seek the ultimate weapon. For the first 50 years of its life, the battleship was that weapon, the nuclear weapon of her day. Now, one by one, America's last battleships have been retired, fitting memorials to the thousands who died in war. Texas, Massachusetts, Alabama, North Carolina. And now the Missouri is in receipt of her final orders. Her guns silenced, her system shut down. She will pass from history into legend and take her place moored near the battleship Arizona as a memorial in Pearl Harbor. Two great warships that mark the beginning and the end of the greatest conflict in human history. Missouri, her name officially stricken from the Register of American Naval Vessels, awaits her fate. The bugle no longer calls her crew to quarters. And yet on those days when the sun glistens on her great guns and the wind whistles down her decks, the ghosts of another time would still seem to speak the question. Is this not the great dreadnought of 3 wars, the peacetime symbol of power the world over? Were not her weapons the finest in the world? And did they not speak peace as well as war? For 50 years, the symbol of American naval power. The battleship. For a century, its guns spoke for the great nations of the world. Instruments of death and destruction. Mighty symbols of national strength and resolve. The battleship. A warrior for all time.
Tomorrow and all week long, you're going on the inside of the tornado. Go inside the eye of the storm. Go inside the technology we need to prepare and fight it. Twister Week on the Inside, beginning tomorrow on the Discovery Channel.